The steppe wind carried ash from burning cities across 1,000 miles. Genghis Khan's armies moved like floodwater, reshaping the landscape of Central Asia between 1219 and 1221. When cities fell, which they did with increasing frequency, a specific pattern emerged. Not in the initial assault, but in what happened afterward, in the systematic processing of royal households. This is what actually occurred. The Khwarazmian Empire stretched from the Caspian Sea to the borders of India. Shah Muhammad II ruled from palaces in Samarkand and Bukhara, cities where irrigation had transformed desert into garden, where libraries held texts in 12 languages, where trade routes converged and scholars debated in courtyards cooled by fountains. His mother, Turkan Khatun, wielded influence that rivaled his own. His wives occupied positions of administrative authority. His daughters were educated in statecraft and married to regional governors to solidify alliances. When Genghis Khan's envoys were executed in the city of Otrar in 1218, the response wasn't immediate, it was methodical. Mongol armies assembled over months. Supply lines were established, routes were surveyed. Then, in 1219, the movement began, not a raid, and reorganization of territory. Otrar fell first. The city's governor, Inalchuk, who had ordered the envoys killed, was executed by having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears. The symbolism was precise. The man who had seen and heard the insult to Mongol authority would die by those same senses. But the governor's family received different treatment. His wife and daughters were not executed. They were separated from the general population of captives and placed under specific guard. Mongol officers, not common soldiers, supervised their detention. They were transported eastward, away from the devastated city, toward the main Mongol camp. The journey took weeks. They traveled in covered wagons, not on foot like other prisoners. They were fed regularly. They were kept alive and healthy. This wasn't mercy. It was preservation of assets with particular utility. When Bukhara surrendered in 1220, Genghis Khan entered the city and went directly to the central mosque. He dismounted his horse inside the sacred space, a deliberate violation of Islamic law. He addressed the assembled population, telling them their sultan had committed crimes against heaven and that their suffering was divine punishment for their ruler's sins. Then he ordered the mosques emptied of religious texts, so the buildings could be used as stables for Mongol horses. The royal family was extracted from the palace while this religious theater played out. Shah Muhammad's relatives, primarily women and children since the Shah himself had fled, were gathered in a courtyard. Mongol officials moved through them with interpreters, asking questions, not about treasure locations or military positions, about lineage, about marriages, about which women were connected to which noble families, which daughters were betrothed to which governors, which wives had borne sons who might later claim legitimacy. They were being catalogued. The women of high rank were separated into a distinct group. Younger women, particularly daughters of the Shah and his nobles, were examined by Mongol physicians. Not for illness, for fertility indicators, for physical capability to bear children. The examinations were clinical and thorough. Age was recorded. Previous childbirth history was noted. Physical condition was assessed. Those deemed suitable were marked with colored fabric tied around their wrists. Different colors indicated different classifications. though the specific meaning of each color was known only to the Mongol administrators. The marked women were moved to separate tents. The unmarked were distributed among Mongol soldiers as general captives or assigned to labor details. Genghis Khan's approach to conquered royal women followed a logic that had nothing to do with lust or revenge. It was about genetic integration and political neutralization through biological absorption. Mongol law, the Yasa, contained specific provisions about treatment of noble captives. High-ranking women were not to be violated randomly. They were to be assigned. The distinction mattered because assignment carried implications of possession and future utility that random violence did not. When Samarkand fell after a brief siege in 1220, the royal harem was found intact. Dozens of women, wives and concubines of the Shah and his court officials, remained in the palace complex. Mongol forces secured the harem before looting began elsewhere in the city. Guards were posted. An inventory was conducted. The senior wife of Shah Muhammad, a woman whose name appears in Persian chronicles as Taj al-Din Khatun, was brought before Genghis Khan personally. She was in her 40s, past childbearing age, but politically valuable. She had relatives governing cities that had not yet fallen. She had sons commanding military units still in the field. Genghis Khan questioned her directly through interpreters. He asked about succession protocols, about which of the Shah's sons had the strongest claim to legitimacy, about which tribal alliances supported which factions. She refused to answer. She was not tortured. She was confined, and her daughters were brought to her one at a time over the following days. The daughters were not harmed in her presence. They were simply exhibited, presented as evidence of Mongol control. Then they were removed. The message was procedural. Cooperation would determine allocation. Resistance would not prevent the inevitable distribution, but it would remove her influence over the process. After 3 days, Taj al-Din Khatun provided the information requested. Her daughters were then assigned to Mongol officers of specific ranks based on their birth order and political significance. The eldest daughter, previously betrothed to a Persian nobleman, was given to one of Genghis Khan's senior commanders. The marriage was formalized under Mongol custom within a week. This was the pattern that repeated across the Khwarazmian Empire. Royal daughters were not kept as concubines in the traditional sense. They were married to Mongol leadership according to a hierarchy that matched their former status to equivalent Mongol rank. A Shah's daughter might be given to a general, a governor's daughter to a captain of 1,000, a nobleman's daughter to a captain of 100. These weren't symbolic marriages. They were expected to produce children. Mongol record-keeping, meticulous in all military and administrative matters, extended to tracking these unions. Scribes recorded which captive noblewomen were assigned to which Mongol officers, when marriages were formalized, when pregnancies occurred, when children were born. The children of these unions were raised as Mongols. They were given Mongol names. They were taught Mongol language and customs first, their mother's languages second, if at all. They were trained in horse riding and archery. Boys were integrated into military units. Girls were eventually married to other Mongol families. But the critical element was this: These children carried the bloodlines of the conquered nobility. A daughter born to a Mongol officer and a Khwarazmian princess carried genetic legitimacy to territories the Mongols now controlled. When that daughter later married into another Mongol family, she transferred that legitimacy. When her sons came of age, they could be installed as governors in their maternal grandfather's former territories, with a claim locals might recognize as partially legitimate. This was genetic imperialism, the systematic conversion of conquered royal lineages into Mongol family trees, creating generations of mixed descendants who could administer occupied territories with both Mongol authority and local blood claims. Genghis Khan himself took multiple wives from conquered royal families. The exact number is uncertain, but Persian and Chinese sources reference at least 6 women of royal or noble birth formally married to him after their kingdoms fell. These were not additions to a harem in the sense of women kept for pleasure. They were political integrations. One documented case involves the daughter of the Tangut king. When the Western Shia dynasty fell in 1227, shortly before Genghis Khan's death, the Tangut royal family was brought before him. The king was executed, his sons were executed, his daughters were distributed according to the established system. The eldest daughter, whose name appears in Tangut records as Chaka, was married to Genghis Khan in a formal ceremony that incorporated both Mongol and Tangut elements. She was assigned quarters in the main Mongol camp. She was given Tangut servants who had been captured with her. She was allowed to maintain some Tangut customs in her daily routine. But she was also assigned Mongol attendants who reported on her activities. Her correspondence was monitored. Her movements were restricted to designated areas within the camp. She bore Genghis Khan a son within a year. That son was raised in the Mongol court, but was acknowledged as having Tangut royal heritage. When he came of age, he was considered for administrative positions in formerly Tangut territories. His mixed lineage made him useful for governance in ways a fully Mongol administrator would not be. This utilitarian approach extended to how Genghis Khan treated the mothers of these children. They were maintained in conditions appropriate to their rank, but they were never unsupervised. They could practice their native religions, but only in monitored spaces. They could teach their children about their heritage, but only in ways that framed that heritage as subordinate to Mongol identity. The most strategically important woman in Genghis Khan's custody was Turkan Khatun, the mother of Shah Muhammad II. She was elderly when captured, approximately 60 years old, well past any reproductive utility. But she represented something more valuable than genetic potential. She represented the legitimacy of the Khwarazmian dynasty itself. Turkan Khatun had been the true power behind her son's throne. She had negotiated treaties, directed military appointments, and managed the empire's complex tributary relationships. She knew which tribal leaders could be bought, which religious authorities held genuine influence, which cities would surrender if approached correctly. Genghis Khan kept her alive and confined for over 2 years. She was held in a gur, a traditional Mongol tent, under constant guard. She was questioned regularly through interpreters. The questions were specific: administrative details, revenue systems, irrigation management, judicial procedures. Mongol officials were learning how to run the territories they had conquered, and she was the textbook. She was also leverage. Her grandson, Jalal al-Din, the last significant Khwarazmian military leader, continued resistance in Persia and Afghanistan. Messages were sent to him indicating his grandmother's treatment was linked to his behavior. If he surrendered, she would be given comfortable retirement. If he continued fighting, alternatives would be considered. She died in Mongol custody in 1233, approximately 3 years after her capture. The cause of death wasn't recorded as execution. It was recorded as natural death from age. Whether that was accurate or convenient documentation is uncertain. What is certain is that her death occurred shortly after Jalal al-Din's final military defeat, precisely when her value as leverage had expired. The daughters and granddaughters of Turkan Khatun followed different trajectories. Those of childbearing age were married into Mongol nobility. Their children became administrators in the former Khwarazmian territories. By the second generation, these descendants were functionally Mongol, but they carried names and genealogical claims that locals recognized. When they collected taxes or enforced laws, they did so as Mongol officials, but their Persian and Turkic ancestry provided a thin membrane of cultural legitimacy that pure Mongol administration would lack. This pattern replicated across every major conquest. In China, captured Jin dynasty and Song dynasty princesses were married to Mongol khans and generals. Their children became the administrative class that would eventually form the Yuan dynasty. In Russia, captured Kievan princesses were integrated into Mongol family structures. In the Middle East, captured Abbasid and Ayyubid noblewomen were absorbed into the Ilkhanat's ruling families. The scale was massive. Across Genghis Khan's conquests and those of his immediate successors, tens of thousands of noblewomen from dozens of kingdoms were processed through this system. Not all survived. Disease, childbirth complications, and the harsh conditions of constant military campaigning killed many. But enough survived and bore children that within 2 generations, Mongol ruling families across Eurasia carried genetic material from nearly every major civilization they had conquered. This wasn't accidental mixing from wartime violence. It was systematic integration designed to create a ruling class that could claim legitimacy across cultural boundaries while remaining fundamentally Mongol in identity and loyalty. The long-term consequences exceeded even Mongol planning. Modern genetic studies have identified a Y chromosome lineage carried by approximately 16 million men alive today that traces back to a common ancestor living in Mongolia around the time of Genghis Khan. The distribution of this lineage corresponds closely to the territories of the Mongol Empire. This suggests that Genghis Khan and his close male relatives produced an enormous number of descendants through the systematic integration of conquered noblewomen into Mongol family structures. Those 16 million descendants are not the product of random violence. They are the product of organized reproduction, of marriages arranged according to political hierarchy, of children deliberately raised to carry both Mongol authority and conquered legitimacy, of a system that treated royal wombs as territory to be occupied and utilized for generational advantage. The women who experienced this system left almost no direct testimony. They were not literate in Mongol, so they could not create records in the language of their captors. Their native language writings, if any existed, were not preserved in Mongol archives. What survived were administrative records, lists of marriages, birth registrations, property assignments. The women appear in these documents as items in inventories, names, ages, lineages, assignments, what they thought about their circumstances, how they experienced the transformation from princess to captive, to Mongol wife, to mother of the next generation, exists only in fragments and implications. A few Persian chronicles contain brief passages describing the grief of noble families separated during conquest. A few Chinese sources mention the sorrow of captured princesses sent to Mongolia. But these are observations from outside the experience, not testimony from within it. The silence is itself evidence. These women were removed from the contexts where their voices mattered and placed in contexts where their voices were administratively irrelevant. Their value was biological and symbolic, not intellectual or testimonial. They were not asked to record their experiences. They were expected to produce children and transfer legitimacy. The system did not require their consent or their testimony. It only required their bodies and their bloodlines. Genghis Khan died in 1227, but the system he established continued for generations. His sons and grandsons continued marrying conquered noblewomen. The practice became so institutionalized that by the time of Kublai Khan in the late 13th century, Mongol royal marriage protocols explicitly included provisions for incorporating foreign princesses. The Yuan dynasty in China maintained entire departments dedicated to managing the complex genealogies of mixed Mongol Chinese imperial relatives. By the 14th century, the Mongol Empire had fragmented, but the genetic integration had created a new reality. Ruling families across Asia carried Mongol ancestry mixed with Chinese, Persian, Turkic, Russian, and Tibetan bloodlines. The boundaries between conqueror and conquered had blurred at the biological level, creating populations that could not be easily categorized as purely one ethnicity or another. This was the ultimate consequence of what Genghis Khan did to enemy queens and their daughters. Not immediate violence, but long-term absorption. Not destruction of royal lineages, but their conversion into components of Mongol genealogy. Not the ending of dynasties, but their biological annexation. The conquered kingdoms disappeared as political entities. Their territories were absorbed into the Mongol Empire. Their administrative systems were replaced or restructured. Their military forces were destroyed or integrated, but their royal bloodlines continued, carried forward in the veins of children raised as Mongols, speaking Mongol, serving Mongol Khans, but carrying genetic legitimacy to the lands their maternal ancestors had once ruled. This was empire building at the chromosomal level, the systematic conversion of political conquest into biological reality, the transformation of defeated royal houses into genetic resources for maintaining control across generations and vast distances. Genghis Khan didn't just conquer territory, he conquered lineages. And the wombs of enemy queens and their daughters were the mechanism through which that conquest became permanent.